In this reflection, we explore what Yeshua says about suffering and how his words and actions can be understood in light of the law and the prophets, that is, the Tanakh. Suffering is one of the most demanding themes in both theology and ethics. Throughout history, people have asked why suffering exists, who is to blame, and whether pain might carry a hidden meaning. But Yeshua rarely engages in such explanations. Instead, he shifts attention elsewhere. He does not primarily ask why people suffer, but how suffering is to be met. With him, suffering is not a theoretical problem to be solved, but a concrete reality that reveals ethical responsibility. To understand this, Yeshua must be read within his own tradition. He was a Jewish teacher interpreting the Torah and the prophets in a world shaped by occupation, poverty, and violence. When he speaks about suffering, he does so with the Exodus, the wilderness, exile, the prophets, and the figure of the suffering servant in mind. This provides a framework in which suffering is neither romanticized nor explained away and never sanctified, but taken seriously as a sign that something is deeply wrong with the world. And we will therefore examine how Yeshua's ethics of suffering stand in continuity with the Tanakh. We will see how suffering becomes an ethical calling, how responsibility replaces speculation, and how hope in God's coming reign gives direction without turning pain into something meaningful in itself. Let us begin. When we read the Gospels, it is striking how realistic Yeshua speaks about suffering. He never promises his followers a life without pain, loss, or injustice. On the contrary, he assumes that suffering is part of living in a world shaped by abuse of power, injustice, and violence. At the same time, he clearly rejects the idea that suffering in itself is good, desirable, or salvific. Suffering is not an ideal, and it is never a goal. This perspective does not stand on its own. When Yeshua speaks of the law and the prophets, he places himself within the whole story of the Tanakh, the long narrative of a people marked by slavery, exile, loss, and hope. In this tradition, suffering is never an abstract philosophical puzzle. It is historical, social, and concrete, and precisely for that reason, it is always an ethical matter. The foundation of this ethic is found in the story of the Exodus. There, suffering is something God sees and hears. The cry of the people rises up, and God's response is not an explanation of why slavery had to happen, but an intervention that breaks it. Slavery is not presented as a meaningful trial, but as injustice. Liberation does not justify suffering after the fact, it interrupts it. This becomes fundamental for how suffering is understood in the Torah. For this reason, the Torah repeatedly reminds the people that they themselves were slaves, not in order to glorify pain, but to prevent it from being repeated. Suffering is not to be explained away, but remembered, so that it is not inflicted on others. Having suffered does not make one superior. It creates responsibility. Human power must be limited, or suffering will be reproduced. When Yeshua encounters the sick, the poor, and the marginalized, he does not interpret their suffering as punishment from God. He does not ask what they have done wrong. He shifts attention away from blame and toward responsibility. The question is not what this person deserves, but how we meet the one who suffers. How do we act rightly when confronted with another person's pain? In this sense, suffering becomes an ethical calling. It reveals what kind of people we are and what kind of society we are building. Yeshua reacts sharply to religious systems that can explain suffering but do nothing to relieve it. For him, compassion is not primarily a feeling but an action. To see suffering and not act is not neutrality, it is an ethical failure. This perspective is deepened by the stories of the wilderness. Freedom after the Exodus is fragile. Life in the desert is marked by fear, scarcity, and conflict. The Torah does not romanticize this period. It shows how a people who themselves suffered under oppression can quickly begin to inflict new suffering on one another through mistrust, greed, and the misuse of power. Suffering does not come only from outside. It can also be produced from within. This forms an essential background for Yeshua's ethics. Suffering is not only something that happens to us passively. It can also be actively created through indifference, exclusion, and violence. Ethics, therefore, is not first of all about correct belief or ritual precision, but about how people treat one another in concrete situations, especially when fear and scarcity push toward harsh choices. Moving further into the Tanakh, we encounter the experience of exile. The fall of Jerusalem and the deportation to Babylon represent a collective catastrophe. Yet even here, simplistic explanations are rejected. Exile is not portrayed as suffering God desires for its own sake, but as the consequence of long-standing injustice, political, economic, and religious. The prophets insist that suffering reveals something that was already wrong before disaster struck. In the prophetic tradition, suffering becomes a mirror. It shows who pays the price for the choices of society. Widows, orphans, the poor, and the foreigner become indicators of moral reality. God is not portrayed as delighting in pain, but as rejecting worship that coexists with oppression. When Yeshua says that mercy outweighs sacrifice, he stands firmly within this prophetic continuity. At the same time, Yeshua is honest about the cost of living rightly. To stand up against injustice, to refuse participation in violence, to love enemies, and to speak truth in the presence of power, all of this comes at a price. Suffering does not arise because God wills it, but because the world often reacts with resistance when injustice is challenged. For this reason, Yeshua clearly distinguishes between suffering inflicted by oppression and suffering that follows ethical integrity. The first must be resisted and confronted. The second may become unavoidable, but it is never to be romanticized. Disciples are not called to seek suffering, but to remain faithful to what is good, even when it is costly. This distinction becomes especially clear in Yeshua's ethic of nonviolence. He does not call for passive submission, but for a radical form of resistance that breaks the logic of violence. By refusing to respond to evil with evil, one may end up bearing suffering without passing it on. In this way, suffering does not become a goal, but a stopping point, a place where the spiral of violence loses its grip. It is within this prophetic horizon that the Jewish interpretation of Isaiah 53 belongs. The text of the suffering servant is not primarily read as a prediction of one specific future individual, but as a portrayal of Israel or of a righteous minority suffering in an unjust world. The servant suffers not because suffering is good, but because justice provokes power. The suffering is representative. It bears witness. It exposes. A decisive moment in the text is the recognition that comes afterward. Those who observed believed the suffering to be divine punishment. Later, they realized that it was their own actions that caused the pain. Responsibility is shifted away from God and back onto the community. The suffering is not explained, it is revealed. This perspective fits seamlessly with Yeshua's ethics. With him as well, suffering becomes a mirror that holds the community accountable. When Yeshua encounters those who suffer, he does not ask what God has done to them, but what human beings are doing, or failing to do, to one another. Suffering becomes the place where ethical seriousness is most clearly exposed. In light of this Jewish reading of Isaiah 53, Yeshua's own suffering can also be understood, not as a metaphysical necessity, but as the consequence of a life lived in consistent faithfulness to justice, mercy, and nonviolence. He challenges power, exposes hypocrisy, and refuses to legitimize violence. The response is resistance. His suffering, therefore, is not a break with the Tanakh, but a confirmation of its ethical realism. The righteous can be rejected. Truth can be costly, not because God desires suffering, but because injustice rarely tolerates being exposed. In this sense, Yeshua stands in the same line as the prophets and the suffering servant, not as an exception, but as a recognizable pattern. Yeshua nevertheless connects suffering to hope, but not as a reward in a distant heaven. Hope is grounded in the vision of God's coming reign, a world in which justice, mercy, and human dignity have the final word. Suffering is therefore not the end of the story, but a sign that the world is not yet as it should be. Ethically, this means that Yeshua does not give us an explanation for why people suffer, but a responsibility for what we do when they do. Suffering becomes a mirror. It reveals whether we choose indifference or solidarity, comfort or justice, power or love. Finally, it is crucial to note that Yeshua himself does not stand outside suffering. He does not speak about it from above, but from within. His life ends in brutal injustice, not because suffering is holy, but because power often responds violently when challenged by truth and ethics. Precisely for this reason, his words about suffering carry credibility. They are lived, not merely taught. With Yeshua, suffering is never detached theology, it is ethical reality. And the question he leaves us with is not, Why do people suffer? But what kind of people do we become when they do? Thank you for listening. If you found this reflection meaningful, feel free to like, share, comment, and subscribe. May peace, courage, and compassion accompany you. Blessings.